In the quiet stretches of the northern lands, where mist lingered over hills long abandoned by kings, the legacy of Arnor whispered through the forests and ruins. Stones, weathered and moss-covered, bore silent testimony to a kingdom fractured by time and treachery. And yet, amid the desolation, a lineage endured. Aragorn, heir of Isildur, moved through these hidden paths, not as a conqueror but as a shadow of memory and purpose, bearing the subtle weight of centuries in his every step. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, a tangible reminder that history, though silent, remained alive, pressing upon the present with quiet insistence. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if aware that one who walked in such a lineage carried a gravity beyond ordinary measure. He learned the land as it had been taught to few, each ridge a marker of ancient battles, each river a boundary once guarded with vigilance and oath. In his exile he was both observer and student, understanding that knowledge of terrain could equate to power unseen. The rangers of the north moved with him, disciples of secrecy, their steps light yet purposeful, attuned to the rhythms of forests that had forgotten the laughter of men. From them Aragorn learned patience, discretion, and the quiet influence of presence. It was in this discipline, subtle and unassuming, that the seeds of a formidable authority were sown, a power that would not only guide men but unsettle the greatest of dark wills. Far to the south, in the fortress of Mordor, eyes unseen yet piercing swept across the lands. Sauron, the Lord of Shadows, perceived not only armies but patterns of thought, currents of intention that flowed beyond immediate sight. Names, faces, and deeds reached him like echoes through the void, some faint and some starkly clear. Among these ripples of influence, one figure drew a persistent note of anxiety. The ranger who was heir to a line long thought diminished, yet whose movements suggested an awareness and purpose that could not be dismissed. Sauron's dread was not born merely of sword or shield, but of foresight, the recognition that some threats are invisible until their consequences unfold. In these northern wilds, Aragorn's days were measured by observation, training, and the quiet refinement of judgment. He learned to read the subtle signs of seasons, to anticipate the paths of travelers, and to discern when caution alone was sufficient and when action was required. His was a power of perception honed to precision, a combination of inherited knowledge and disciplined skill. And though his deeds went unnoticed by the wider world, they accumulated significance in ways that few could perceive. The reforging of Narsil, though still years away, was already a symbol in waiting, an unspoken herald that lineage and legacy carried force beyond mere ceremonial weight. Even in solitude, the lessons of kings past murmured through him, shaping decisions that seemed to the unobservant almost instinctive. It was not arrogance but understanding, the knowledge that history repeats itself, not always in event, but in consequence. Each step through the northern hills, each careful patrol along a forgotten road, served as preparation for challenges that would emerge like shadows from the east. And though men rarely witnessed the precision of his intent, those who did felt the unspoken authority that comes not from command but from certainty of purpose. The forest around him held a patient silence, and yet it was filled with signs of life, subtle movements, and the interplay of light and shadow that taught vigilance and restraint. Here, in these quiet corridors of memory and nature, Aragorn cultivated the hidden power that would one day terrify a dark lord. Sauron's gaze, distant yet all-encompassing, began to measure not just armies, but the alignment of intention, the unseen threads that could unravel his dominion. The heir of Isildur was not yet king, nor fully known, but already he was counted among the variables that unsettled even the greatest of the Dark Lord's designs. As night descended and the mists thickened, The silhouette of the ranger merged with the shadowed hills. Every step he took was a lesson in restraint and foresight, a quiet preparation for the reckoning that lay beyond the horizon. In these early movements, he carried the weight of history, the precision of learned patience, and the latent authority of a name long thought diminished. In this silence, power gathered unnoticed, a current of inevitability that would one day flow into the open and test the very foundations of darkness. And far away in the blackened towers of Mordor, an unseen dread began to stir, sensing what the world would only understand when the time was fully come. The rain that swept the northern hills that season came not with fury, but with a quiet insistence, soaking earth and stone, filling hollows where footsteps had once passed. Beneath the sodden canopy of pine and ash, Aragorn walked with the silent purpose of one long accustomed to being unseen. His cloak, dark and weather-stained, merged with the surrounding woods. And yet he did not vanish. He became the landscape itself. To move unseen, he had learned, was not merely a matter of stealth, but of sympathy with the world around him. Years had passed since his true name had been spoken aloud in the halls of men, known now as Strider to some, and Estel to the few who remembered his beginning. He had been raised, not among kings, but under the wary watch of Elrond in the sanctuary of Rivendell. There, far from the memory of Isildur's last breath, Aragorn was taught to read not only ancient scrolls and fading prophecies, but also the faces of men, the way fear shadows judgment, how pride conceals ignorance, and how silence wisely held commands more than loud proclamations. Elrond had withheld his lineage from him until the hour was right, knowing that the weight of ancestry was not something to be placed on a boy's shoulders. When Aragorn came of age and learned the truth of his bloodline, it did not lift him, it anchored him, a sword not yet reforged, a name not yet claimed. In that revelation he understood not glory, but burden. The kingdom of men, splintered and weary, did not wait for him with banners, it forgot him with time. That forgetting became his greatest gift. Among the rangers of the north, scattered and few, Aragorn found his path. Their lives were not marked by heraldry or feast, but by vigilance, by the unthanked work of watching the borders of a fading world. He learned from them the art of delay, the patience of hunting not prey but pattern. Aught raiding parties, strange lights over desolate fields, the subtle stirrings of something long sleeping. These were the signs they read. And in them, Aragorn became not just a watcher, but a knower of the hidden tides beneath the surface of events. It was not battle that made him formidable, though he was no stranger to blade or bow. It was the habit of understanding consequence, of waiting until certainty formed in the stillness before acting. This, above all else, would one day unnerve the Dark Lord, for Sauron did not fear brute force. He had crushed it before. He feared the quiet long game, the chessboard he could not see, where a single piece moved slowly but with purpose, never wasting position or betraying intent too soon. Even now, in those damp northern woods, Aragorn moved not as a solitary figure, but as one entangled in currents larger than himself. The lost kingdom of Arnor was in his blood. So too were the mistakes of Isildur. He carried them not as guilt, but as memory sharpened into vigilance. Where his forefather reached for victory too soon, Aragorn waited. Where others sought to claim, he observed. His education was not in conquest, but in consequence. In long evenings beneath the stars, he would sit by a fire, no larger than his cupped hands, and trace the old songs in his mind. Some spoke of Elendil's march, others of Númenor's fall. Each tune was a thread, and in the weave of them, he saw the design that stretched far beyond his lifetime. It was here that his hidden strength grew, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as memory crystallized into clarity. He knew, though few did, that a power built on fear is most threatened by what it cannot predict, and Aragorn had become, by will and by training, an unraidable force, neither king nor commoner, soldier nor sage. He was all and none. This ambiguity was his armor, his shield against the eye. Sauron, for all his power, could not see him clearly. He searched for swords, for banners, for declarations, but Aragorn offered none, only motion, only patience, only the steady beat of footsteps through forgotten trails. Night fell early in those northern hills, and the mists returned, curling like memory around the trunks of ancient trees. Somewhere beyond the mountains, far to the east, the fire of Barad-dûr burned in silence, ever watchful. And though no word was spoken between them, the ranger in the wild and the shadow in the tower had already begun their long conversation. One moved through knowledge, the other through fear, and between them a thread now stretched, tense, invisible, inevitable. Before that thread could be pulled taut, there was still much to unfold, for Aragorn's movements, subtle as they were, had begun to draw eyes not only from Mordor, but from allies and enemies alike, and the time would soon come when names forgotten would rise again, not in proclamation, but in quiet recognition. But in Coruscant, why even the whisper of that name made the dark stir. We must next step into the gaze of the eye itself, and glimpse what Sauron feared to admit. From the darkened heights of Barad-dûr, where no stars could pierce the dense clouds that gathered unnaturally over Mordor, the eye turned. It did not blink, nor rest, nor yield. Its gaze, burning yet incorporeal, stretched outward across leagues of land, scanning not just for armies or weapons, but for patterns, disruptions in the flow of dominion. To Sauron, control was a tapestry of certainties, allegiances bought, resistances crushed, and lines of power mapped like veins in stone. Yet somewhere in the north, that tapestry had begun to warp, however subtly. A flicker, a pause in the pattern. The presence of something not accounted for. It was not the name Aragorn that first caught his attention, but the ripple he left. Reports, fragments, rumors, villages spared without explanation, orc bands found dismembered, but no banners left behind. A shadow passing through lands where only the remnants of men still clung to memory. The rangers had always been a nuisance, but this was different. Sauron did not fear chance. He feared deliberate mystery. In the Palantir, the eye sought clarity, but the north gave him none. It resisted exposure. What he did see troubled him more. The movement of influence without noise, the forging of allegiance without proclamation. And then a name returned from the long memory of his servants. Isildur, a bloodline thought diminished. A sword once broken, a claim unresolved. It was not prophecy that unnerved Sauron, but pattern recognition. In his deep cunning, he saw that history moved in spirals, and the coil was tightening again. He commanded his lieutenants to look deeper. Nazgûl were dispatched to range wider than before, not merely to sow fear, but to search for the source of the silence. Reports from Dol Guldur hinted at a man whose presence bent outcomes without revealing intent. He was not yet a king, but others already deferred to him. He held no throne, yet when he spoke, hardened captains listened. This quiet authority was a danger more insidious than open rebellion. Sauron understood strength, for he had bent it to his will countless times, but this was strength refined into discretion. Lineage buried in silence, influence masked as vagabondage. It defied the metrics of domination. The eye craved definition, but the figure it sought moved like fog, shaping events without being shaped by them. That above all, made him dangerous, not for what he was, but for what he was becoming. The eye turned to the old texts. Sauron remembered too well the fall of Númenor, the fracturing of Arnor, the long dispersal of its blood. He had assumed time had diluted all that once threatened him, but time had also hidden seeds. And now one of them stirred. He did not need to know the man's face to feel the tremor in the design. The fear was not of swords, but of alignment, of the right mind in the right moment, holding to a cause not out of ambition, but inheritance. Andúril had not yet been reforged, but the premonition of its flame already stung his vision. In the quiet corners of Middle-earth, symbols began to awaken. The line of Elros, the banner of the white tree. Even the silence of the elves became more watchful, more deliberate. Sauron knew from long memory that power often returned not with thunder, but with stillness. Still, he was not afraid in the manner of lesser creatures. He was wary, as one who calculates the shape of a future that bends against his will. He began to direct his forces more cautiously. Not all was to be scorched. Some paths were now to be watched, their outcomes deferred. If this figure was who he suspected, he could not be confronted yet. The game had grown complex, and the board required new arrangements. Yet in the depths of his spirit, where even shadowed certainty began to fray, Sauron felt something unfamiliar, resistance not rooted in defiance, but in dignity. A man who sought no crown, it bore its weight better than most who had worn one. The eye, relentless and piercing, could not bind that. It could only circle it, ever more agitated by the one shape it could not reduce. So the search widened. He ordered the watching of lands long dismissed. Every whispered name, every silent outpost, became a point of inquiry, not to destroy yet, but to measure. And in the flicker of that uncertainty, dread began to root itself deeper than fear ever had. What kind of man moves the world without being seen? What kind of power does not announce itself, yet shifts alliances, bends fates, and stirs even the dark to attention? To know that answer, we must next return to the blade not yet drawn, and the relics of a forgotten covenant that even now gather meaning in the shadows. It was said that the sword lay broken for an age, its shards kept not for battle, but as memory sharp, sacred, unresolved. In a quiet chamber within Rivendell, beneath tapestries that held the long weft of elven memory, the fragments of Narsil rested under watchful silence. Few approached them with familiarity. Even fewer understood what it meant that they had not yet been reforged. But time had shifted. In quiet steps across the north and the rising unease in the east, a tremor had begun to spread through the fabric of Middle-earth. And with it Elrond knew that what was broken could no longer remain dormant. For power, if left inert too long, becomes myth, and myths cannot stand in the shadow of darkness. When the sword was finally reforged, it was not a ritual of spectacle. It was an act of precision, of memory fused into purpose. The elven smiths, patient beyond reckoning, rejoined the metal not to restore what had been lost, but to awaken what had been waiting. Andúril, flame of the west, was born from what once struck down Sauron, and then failed to finish him. But now its edge gleamed not with vengeance, but with clarity. It was no longer the sword of Isildur. It was the sword of one who had learned from Isildur's failing. To Aragorn, receiving Andúril was not an accession to kingship. It was a quiet reckoning. He held it first in silence, the weight unfamiliar and familiar all at once. The runes along its blade shimmered with faint light, etched with names older than Gondor, older even than the Tower of Barad-dûr. He did not speak. He did not bow. He simply turned the blade in his hand, testing its truth. For in truth it was not a weapon that made a king, but the burden he chose to carry while holding it. The sword was more than forged steel. It was a symbol of a covenant half forgotten and half fulfilled. Those who saw it drawn did not merely see strength. They saw lineage, hope, and the silent resurgence of a claim that could not be erased. Among the elves, it stirred old loyalties. Among men, it rekindled something dangerously close to belief. And in the east, in the realm of shadows, the tremor deepened. Sauron did not yet know the name of the blade, but he felt its reawakening. The eye does not see everything, but it senses alignment, the convergence of symbols and meaning. Where once the north had been quiet, now it pulsed. A resonance, an echo of a wound that had never fully closed. The threat of Aragorn was no longer confined to motion or rumor. It had acquired shape. The sword was its harbinger. Armies had risen before, leaders had declared themselves heirs. But none had carried the artifact that bore the weight of both triumph and failure. Andúril was not a tool, it was an answer. Not to the question of might, but to the deeper fear that something once broken could return stronger than before. And even in that, there was danger. For the reforging of Narsil did not merely awaken allies, it roused watchers in the dark, forces that remembered the blade that had severed their master's hand. Word would travel, as it always did, through birds and spies, through whispers in crooked tongues. The sword reforged, the line restored. Sauron would soon know. But Aragorn, even with Andúril at his side, did not hasten toward throne or triumph. He remained in the wild, blade sheathed, presence measured. He knew that symbols were not enough. They inspired, yes, but inspiration without readiness was a spark in dry wind. He needed alliances. He needed trust born not from spectacle, but from presence, from walking beside others, not ahead of them. And so, the sword remained mostly unseen. Yet when it was drawn, even briefly, it silenced rooms. In the halls of Rohan, in the council of Elrond, in the glances of men weary from loss. It changed the air, not because of magic, but because of memory. For Middle-earth had not forgotten, it had only slept. And now something ancient stirred within it. Still, power does not move forward without consequence. The sword's reappearance marked Aragorn, not just as a claimant, but as a challenge. The enemies he had evaded with obscurity would soon name him clearly. The eye would turn more sharply. The land would shift. And so, with Andúril at his hip, Aragorn moved toward those he would need. Not soldiers, but minds. Not declarations, but shared purpose. And among them one figure stood at the threshold of trust and fear. An old friend, a wizard who saw further than most, and who had long waited for this convergence. To understand how the sword's return reshaped more than fate, we must step next into the quiet councils. It was in the quiet halls of Rivendell, where time moved like water over stone, that Gandalf stood waiting. His eyes, deep and shadowed with memory, turned as Aragorn approached, not as a stranger, nor as a servant of counsel, but as something else. Between them stretched years of shared silence, battles unnamed, and words exchanged beneath stars in languages forgotten by most of the world. The wizard did not bow. He merely nodded, for there were few left who required neither explanation nor greeting. The sword at Aragorn's side drew a moment's pause. Andúril had not sung yet, but even sheathed, it resonated with a presence that altered the mood of the room. Gandalf, ever one to weigh signs before speaking, let the silence linger. Then, with a voice both gentle and grave, he asked, "So it is done?" Aragorn gave no answer beyond his gaze. That was enough, for the wizard had long watched the threads of power, and in this man, tall, weathered, quiet, he now saw not only potential, but decision. The time of wandering had not ended, but it had shifted. Direction now replaced drift. That was more dangerous than any sword. Their counsels stretched deep into the night, long after the halls emptied of elven song. They spoke not only of Sauron, but of men, their fears, their faults, their flickering loyalties. Gandalf knew that brute force would not win what was coming. The world would not be saved by armies alone. It would be saved by clarity of purpose, of lineage, of rightful claim, and the ability to inspire action without command. That was why Aragorn mattered, not as a warrior, but as a fulcrum. He could bend the wills of others, not through spell or manipulation, but through example, through presence. And that Gandalf understood, terrified Sauron more than any ring of power, for the Dark Lord's dominion thrived in confusion, in doubt. A figure like Aragorn, certain yet unboastful, was a light against which shadow had little hold. Together they spoke of alliances, of Theoden, whose mind was clouded but not lost, of Denethor, proud and sharp, but brittle in grief, of men who would need more than swords to rise. They would need memory restored, hope legitimized. Aragorn did not argue. He knew the weight of the path before him. The blade at his side was only the beginning. Gandalf placed no crown upon his head. He offered no prophecy. Instead, he handed Aragorn a list, names, places, routes, small fires in the dark, those who could be rallied if only the right voice reached them. It was not command, it was invitation, and that was the strategy that Sauron could not counter. The eye searched for armies and declarations, but these were movements in whispers. An old captain in the east, who remembered Elendil's seal, a border village once loyal to the kings of Arnor, a healer in Gondor, whose loyalty ran deeper than blood. Aragorn's campaign was not one of conquest, it was a quiet restoration. Even so, with each alliance forged, each fire rekindled, the weight grew heavier. For every man who looked to him, every hand that gripped Andúril in reverence, added another layer to the silent question. Would he accept what must be claimed? Would he sit where none had sat for centuries? He did not answer. He only moved forward. And Sauron, though still blind to the face behind the rumor, felt the shape of it closing in. His agents grew restless. Orc bands moved with more urgency. The Nazgûl shifted their circles wider. Yet the true threat still eluded him. Cloaked in common garb, walking not behind armies but beside shepherds, wanderers, and broken kings. The strength of Aragorn's rise was not marked in drums, but in the changing nature of counsel itself. Where once the free peoples had gathered in fear, they now began to speak in possibility. That was the work of quiet conversations, of long pauses filled not with hesitation but reflection. In one such moment, as dawn touched the far peaks beyond Rivendell, Gandalf placed a hand on Aragorn's shoulder, not to direct him, but to steady him. "You do not walk alone," he said. And it was not comfort, but confirmation, for already footsteps were echoing in the east. Others stirred, moved, changed by the rumor of the man with the broken sword reforged. But the next movement in this long game would not come from the hills or the towers. It would come from the realms Sauron thought fully hid. To trace how fear took root even within Mordor's confidence, we must next turn to the Eye itself, its agents, its reach, and the shadows cast not by light, but by silence. From the walls of Barad-dûr, where stone met shadow in seamless descent, the will of Sauron extended far beyond what eyes could see. There were no torches in the chambers of the Dark Tower, for light served no purpose here. Knowledge came not through flame or scroll, but through instruments older than memory. Palantiri turned to ruin, minds bent to obedience, and spirits that no longer spoke in their own voice. Through these, Sauron reached across the world, not to observe, but to dominate understanding itself. The Nazgul had ridden in widening circles, their whispers stirring fear in corners that once knew peace. Their presence was not merely to pursue the ring, but to sense disturbance, to locate the faintest tremor of threat. And yet, in the north, they found something elusive, not resistance, not power, but stillness, too perfect, too deliberate. It was this stillness that gnawed at Sauron's mind. He had grown accustomed to watching power declare itself, kings who claimed lineage, captains who built armies, cities that fortified and failed, but now the pattern was interrupted. Reports came of movements too organized for coincidence, too quiet for pride, rangers repositioned in forgotten ruins, small garrisons evaded, supply lines untouched. Something moved behind the veil, and it moved not with conquest but with restraint. The eye turned inward, seeking within itself the calculus of fear. For Sauron, dread was not an emotion, but an equation. Fear, properly applied, became clarity. It made men predictable. It hollowed out rebellion before swords were drawn. But in this new presence, this figure, who wore no crown, who bore no sigil, there was no foothold for fear. He could not be baited, provoked, or exposed. That was new. That was dangerous. So the agents of Mordor shifted, spies, many unwilling, embedded in taverns, caravans, and corners of markets. They listened, not for declarations, but for absences. Who was not present? Who moved at night? Who left no trace? Aragorn's path was not hidden by magic, but by method. He moved with the land, not against it, shaping his absence like an echo in a ruined hall. Even the wind did not remember where he had passed. In Dol Guldur, the lesser stronghold of darkness, Sauron's lieutenants whispered of a rumor, of a man whose very presence broke the rhythm of their reconnaissance. His name was not always spoken, but the pattern of his deeds created a silhouette impossible to ignore. Where he passed, resistance solidified. Where he lingered, despair retreated. It was not might, it was influence. Influence, Sauron understood, could not be crushed by siege or fire. It had to be isolated, dismissed, made irrelevant. And yet this man, this heir, refused to make himself vulnerable to any of those strategies. He declared nothing, asked for no followers, wore no crown. His refusal to play the part of a challenger made him the most dangerous piece on the board. The Dark Lord turned again to the Palantir. But even these ancient stones, once proud and pure, had grown treacherous. What they revealed, they distorted. Visions of fire, broken trees, the glint of a blade in twilight. He saw the sword Andúril, but not the man who wielded it. That absence became a wound, and in the depths of Mordor, Sauron summoned what remained of his counselors. Wraiths, half-men, corrupted seers. Their counsel was uniform. Tighten the noose, spread confusion, strike at the roots before the tree rises. But which root? That was the question. The threat was not a tower or a throne. It was a man, and the man refused to behave like one. So orders were issued, quiet and cold. Cities once left untouched would be watched. Roadways that seemed too quiet would be stirred. The West would be prodded, not to conquer, but to force response, to make the quiet man move, to make him act too soon. But Sauron miscalculated one thing. Aragorn did not fear exposure. He simply refused it until it served others more than it served himself. That was a kind of wisdom the Dark Lord could not account for. To Sauron, all power craved revelation. But in Aragorn, power had learned patience, and so the eye turned more often, more frantically, seeking the thread it had missed. It was no longer enough to hunt the ring. Something else had entered the game, something that did not burn but endured. And in that realization, dread deepened, not because the heir was found, but because he had not yet revealed what he truly carried. To follow how that dread became action, we must now step into the wild lands Aragorn had shaped with silence, where the map was no longer drawn by dominion but by quiet design. The north was not empty, though many maps rendered it so pale spaces between bolder names, dismissed as ruin or wilderness. Yet Aragorn knew its paths, not as roads to be traveled, but as threads to be woven. Every glen, every broken tower, every forgotten riverbank was part of a lattice he had walked since youth. Where others saw distance, he saw design. And in the silence of these northern lands, a strategy matured that no war room could contain. The rangers moved with him, scattered but not disordered. They understood the land as a living memory, a record of failure, resistance, and quiet endurance. They were not soldiers of spectacle. They were caretakers of vigilance, heirs of a long watch sworn in obscurity. Under Aragorn's guidance, they became more than guardians. They became instruments of calibration, adjusting the tempo of conflict without drawing its full weight. Or scouts who crept westward, disappeared into thickets that whispered no answer. Messages meant for Sauron's agents were rerouted or delayed, intercepted not with force but with timing. The rangers did not seek open victory. They sought disruption, small cuts that unraveled the coherence of Mordor's far-flung designs. It was warfare by omission, the weaponization of presence and absence alike. Through these acts, Aragorn's influence expanded without need for banners. Settlements once gripped by fear found their roads safer, their nights quieter. The people did not know who to thank. They spoke of shadows that watched from tree lines, of strangers who left no name but scattered evil with purpose. Rumor, Aragorn knew, was a powerful ally. It could move faster than ravens and inspire more trust than any decree. Yet for all the North's wilderness, it was not untouched by history. Arnor's bones remained, etched into the land, weathered watchtowers, cairns half swallowed by moss, and ancient fortresses that still held shape beneath centuries of root and frost. Aragorn moved among them not as a conqueror, but as a son returning to old halls, silent and reverent. Each stone whispered of potential not yet extinguished. One such place, Amon Sul, Weathertop became a nexus of memory and tactic. Once the pride of Arnor's vigilance, it now stood hollow, but not forgotten. Aragorn used it as a silent beacon, a place to gather without drawing notice, to coordinate those who moved across hundreds of leagues. The beacon needed no flame. Its position alone, known to a few, gave structure to the formless. The Nazgul felt this structure, even if they could not name it. Their search patterns changed. They lingered longer in the north, circling ruins with unnatural stillness, as if trying to sniff out a presence that had never left. Their terror was not born of what they found, but what they failed to. Each report sent back to Mordor carried the weight of something missing. For Sauron, it was maddening. Power was meant to cast shadows, to announce itself with disruption. But this man moved like mist, and the land bent subtly in his wake. Villages chose to stand their ground without knowing why. Town leaders, long silent, sent word westward, asking if the kings of old had returned. And somewhere in all of it, a name had begun to resurface, not shouted, not carved, but whispered. Ilesa. Aragorn did not answer it. He let the name move ahead of him, carried by those who needed it more than he did. In his mind, leadership was not a torch lifted, but a fire laid carefully across many hands. The North did not need a king. It needed coordination, memory, belief. He offered these in silence, walking not as a ruler but as a reminder. But such movements, however subtle, came with cost. The rangers were stretched thin. Their numbers, though skilled, could not cover every breach. There were nights when the enemy passed unchallenged, days when villagers vanished before warning could reach them. And in these moments, Aragorn felt the press of legacy against the limits of the present. Strategy alone could not stem the tide forever. Still, he persisted, for the value was not in holding the land, but in preparing it. Each path made safer, each rumor of protection, each glance toward the hills expecting help that was groundwork laid for what would come. When the time arrived to reveal himself, the land would already remember him, not as a stranger ascending a throne, but as the one who had walked beside them unseen. And so the paths of the north remained quiet, but beneath that quiet, something vast stirred. A readiness, a returning. The map, once empty, had been redrawn by footsteps and silence. To understand how this hidden lattice prepared the world for reckoning, we must now trace how Aragorn's claim reached beyond wilderness, into the fractured hearts of kingdoms long sundered, where memory and mandate would soon collide. The White City stood still beneath the weight of its own memory, its high walls and gleaming tiers rising not with confidence but with the grave poise of something long enduring. Gondor did not breathe easily. It held its breath, and within its ancient stones legacy stirred restlessly, uncrowned, unnamed, unresolved. In the citadel of Minas Tirith, Denethor brooded upon the throne that was not a throne. The steward of Gondor, proud and brilliant, felt the gathering storm with a mind sharpened by grief. His line had preserved the realm in the absence of kings, and in that absence his authority had grown roots bitter, resolute, and full of dread. He had heard of the sword reforged, he had heard whispers of a man walking paths, thought long forgot. He had seen shadows stir in his palantir, though what they revealed came with pain, twisted and coiled with lies too close to truth. Yet he said nothing. Not because he did not believe, but because he did. And belief to Denethor meant the end of his line's dominion. A king returning was not merely a restoration of order, it was the collapse of everything he had borne alone. The claim of Aragorn was not a political formality, it was a reckoning. And still, the name passed through the alleys and archives of Gondor like a distant wind. Thorongil, a name from decades past, when a young captain of unknown lineage had served under Icthilien, Denethor's father, a man of valor, veiled in mystery, whose counsel was heeded, and whose victories came with neither demand nor banner. That man had vanished without explanation, but memory, like ash, clings long after fire fades. Few knew that Thorongil and Aragorn were the same. Fewer still could imagine that the heir of Isildur had walked among them recognized, refused to claim, and yet knew the city's secrets better than many who called it home. Aragorn had studied Gondor not from a distance, but from within, years before the darkness began to rise. He had known its strengths and frailties, had respected its traditions while never submitting to them. And in his departure he had left a silence more potent than presence. Now he returned, not in form, but in momentum. Letters, glances, nods, among captains who remembered. Alliances forged in the north sent echoes through the south. Gondor was not yet ready to receive a king, but it had already begun to shift around the possibility. Soldiers trained more seriously. The people looked more often to the east, not only in fear, but in anticipation. The city's sleep had lightened. In Rohan, too, the wind changed. Theoden sat under the weight of illness and whispering counsel. But not all hearts were dimmed. Riders who had once crossed paths with the Grey Pilgrim now recalled strange meetings, moments where a cloaked man in the company of elves or halflings had spoken few words, but left lasting impressions. Aragorn's steps had already passed through the Riddermark, and though he had not claimed authority, his bearing had left marks deeper than any heraldry. Across these kingdoms, Aragorn's presence worked like tide, not crashing, but steady, and those with eyes to see knew that the return of a rightful king did not mean thunder from the sky, but alignment. When symbols long dormant began to stir in tandem, when relics reappeared and oaths were whispered anew, the realm itself began to remember. It was not simple nostalgia, it was the convergence of legitimacy and timing. Aragorn did not rise by force. He rose because the land itself had been waiting for him. His blood carried more than history. It carried the ability to reconcile what had long remained broken. And that Sauron understood too well. Gondor without a king was manageable. It was led by a man burdened by pride and sorrow, inward turned, fragile in spirit. But Gondor with a king who knew discretion, who commanded loyalty without demanding it, who bore both sword and silence, was a threat of a different kind. Not military alone, but metaphysical. It was the return of legitimacy, a line unbroken, a crown once cast aside, rising not with conquest, but with earned inevitability. The eye turned again to the White City. The light of the tower flickered, and in that watchfulness, fear took shape, not because Aragorn had arrived, but because his absence had already begun to transform everything. To see how this influence grew sharper still, we must next follow the ripples of rumor, how whispers of a returning king passed through enemy ears and shaped the darkness to come. In the borderlands where tongues twisted truth and merchants carried more than wares, the name of Aragorn began to take root, not as fact, but as murmured speculation. Rumors traveled swiftly where fear had already softened the soil. In taverns near the Banduin, in way stations shadowed by crumbling stone, a name long thought buried rose with cautious awe. They called him the Strider, the northern captain, the flame-bearer. Some claimed he wielded the blade of Isildur. Others whispered he was Isildur returned. The truth was less important than the momentum. Sauron's spies, trained to detect movement in silence, began to bring back fragments that bore no consistent shape, yet they all pointed to a single silhouette. A man unclaimed by any kingdom, and yet feared by those who walked in shadow. The Dark Lord did not dismiss whispers, he understood their purpose. Rumor, like rot, weakens the structure before the wall falls, and so the eye leaned harder into the world of men, not with armies, but with surveillance. Black speech flowed in hidden circles. Trusted emissaries in Gondor and Rohan began to send strange letters. Some intercepted, some burned unread. Interrogations followed in quiet corners. Villagers disappeared without mention. Entire camps were razed because a name had been spoken over a shared fire. But it was already too late. The rumor had become its own force, gathering meaning as it passed from mouth to mouth. It no longer needed Aragorn's presence to persist. The idea of him, sharpened by mystery and repetition, became a weapon neither Sauron nor his servants could seize. He was not a king, but the potential of one. Not a soldier, but the certainty that war would not be fought on old terms. The Nine, though feared, could not suppress it. They wandered the borderlands more often now, their presence thickening the air. But their silence bred unease. Wherever they appeared, people remembered the old tales, and in remembering spoke the name more boldly. Even denial fed the flame. A thing hunted is a thing worth fearing. In Mordor, the uncertainty fermented. Messengers from the east, bearing intelligence from Harad and Rhûn, noted unusual formations among allied captains, delays in orders, hesitation before engagement, an odd reluctance to commit forces fully, as if something unseen had begun to shape their sense of outcome. Sauron's war machine, vast and brutal, now encountered friction not of resistance, but of hesitation. And what was hesitation but the enemy of conquest? Among the captains of Gondor, the same uncertainty spread. They questioned not the authority of their steward, but the shape of the future. Men who had once followed orders with wearied resolve now asked silent questions with their eyes. If he is truly returned, what then? If the line has not failed, what becomes of all this burden we have carried alone? Sauron saw the pattern forming again, not of armies, but of belief. In the Second Age he had faced Elendil, who stood not as a tyrant but as a light too steady to extinguish by fear alone. And now it was happening again, this slow coalescence around a man who had not yet spoken aloud his claim. That was what truly unsettled the Dark Lord. Aragorn did not move as those who seek dominion. He did not raise banners, did not crown himself in desperation, did not cry out for allegiance. He waited, and the world moved toward him. That movement, Sauron understood, could not be stopped by steel. He tried instead to distort the image. Whispers were sown that the heir was false, that he would bring ruin like Isildur before him, that his return would splinter the fragile unity among men. These rumors spread quickly, but something in them failed to hold. Perhaps it was because the silence of Aragorn stood stronger than any rebuttal. He did not answer lies, he only acted. And with every action, the rumor bent toward truth. Orc patrols found traps too cunning for common folk. Scouts vanished in forests where no army should be. Alliances among men once bitterly divided began to stir toward convergence. Slowly the world began to behave as if he were already king. Sauron could not unmake this, he could only accelerate his plans. Force confrontation before the shape of Aragorn's rise became irreversible. If he could draw him into the open, into battle before belief hardened into fact, perhaps he could still crush the symbol before the man became more than a man. But Aragorn, as ever, refused the bait. He would not hasten, he would not bend. And so the eye turned with growing intensity, seeking the flaw, the opening, the pressure point that could bring him into the light prematurely. To know how Aragorn endured that pressure, and how his resolve reshaped the war before it began, we must next walk beside those who trusted him not because he demanded it, but because he had already borne their burdens in silence. Trust, when quietly earned, becomes armor more enduring than steel. Aragorn had never asked for loyalty, yet wherever he went, those who walked beside him found themselves changed, not through oath or command, but by the measured weight of his attention. He carried the burdens of others as if they were his own, and in doing so lessened them. Men did not follow him because he claimed a crown. They followed him because he had already borne the weight of one without speaking it aloud. In the dales of Eriador, where crumbling walls marked battles lost to time, he had once lifted a wounded child from the ashes of a raided village and stayed beside her through the long night while her kin were buried. In the woods of Ithilien, years before open war, he had brought medicine to a dying ranger whose name history would never remember. These acts were not seen by many, but those who witnessed them spoke of a man who did not lead from above, but from within. It was not only the rangers who felt this quiet gravity. Dwarves respected him, not for his stature, but for the care with which he treated old stone and older memory. Among the elves he was received not as a guest, but as one of their own, a rare bridge between mortal flame and immortal frost. Even the hobbits, unburdened by lineage and indifferent to heraldry, trusted him from the start. That trust, once given by the small and the simple, was a sign clearer than prophecy. In every corner of Middle-earth, those who stood near him sensed something steady beneath the surface. He did not waver in grief, nor flinch before shadow. And yet, he mourned. He doubted. He waited. These were not weaknesses. They were signs of a man who had not mistaken silence for indecision, nor mercy for softness. In the great halls of Elrond, Aragorn's presence drew respect not by design, but by recognition. When he spoke, even Galadriel listened, not because his words carried the tone of royalty, but because they carried the weight of having watched, endured, and understood. It was said that the wisest know when to remain silent. Aragorn had perfected the art. Gandalf knew this well. In council, the wizard often deferred to Aragorn, not out of hierarchy, but because he saw in him the rarest kind of leader, one who chooses not to lead unless it is necessary. It was this restraint, this refusal to grasp at power, that made his claim undeniable. The one who does not hunger for the crown is the one most fit to wear it. Anduril, ever sheathed at his side, had become an extension of that truth. It shone not for threat, but for memory. Each time it was drawn, it was a reminder not of blood to come, but of blood already spilled. The men who followed Aragorn knew this. They did not follow for victory. They followed because he bore the cost before asking them to. Even in Rohan, where suspicion ran deep and pride ran deeper, his arrival did not spark jealousy. When Eomer looked into Aragorn's eyes, he saw not competition but kinship. Two men bound by duty, not reward, and though Theoden's heart was clouded by grief and manipulation, a small part of it stirred when Aragorn stepped through the gate. Not because of prophecy, because of presence. The free peoples, long scattered and inward turned, began to speak again, not in speeches, but in shared glances, in preparations, in readiness. Something had shifted, not in declarations of war, but in quiet resolve. They would fight, not because they believed they would win, but because they believed they stood beside someone who would not abandon them when defeat seemed sure. Even Frodo, burdened with the darkest path of all, had trusted him without prompting. That bond, forged under stars on a perilous road, had never broken. For Frodo had seen behind Aragorn's eyes not a warrior, but a man who would carry sorrow to its end if it meant sparing another. And Sauron, who understood power better than most, had begun to feel the outlines of this trust. He could not see its source, but he felt its reach. Confidence among his enemies was not growing by chance. It had a center. It moved quietly, like a shadow against firelight, invisible to the unwise, undeniable to those with eyes, sharpened by fear. To dismantle it, he would need more than force. He would need to shatter the image of inevitability. He would need to strike where the man was most vulnerable, not in body but in the network of loyalty that held him upright. But before that attempt could be made, the great wheels of war began to turn, and Aragorn, who had waited in patience and silence for so long, would at last have to step forward, not into glory, but into decision, to witness how the tide of dread crested into open confrontation. We must now follow the ripples to where battle gathered, and where the quiet man prepared to raise his voice. The wind before war carried no sound but its own. From the plains of Rohan to the deep fields of Gondor, it swept across the lands like a single vast breath drawn before speech. The sky dimmed in hue, neither night nor day, as if even the heavens awaited what must come. In the hush before armies moved, every heart listened for signs, hoofbeats, horns, or words that might never be spoken. In this threshold of stillness, Aragorn stood apart from his men, gazing eastward. Beyond the horizon, Mordor smoldered in unseen silence, and though his eyes could not pierce that far, he felt its gaze return. The air was heavy with premonition. He had carried silence for years, but now it pressed differently, an inheritance nearing its moment of reckoning. Around him, the captains murmured strategy, Gimli with his certainty, Legolas with quiet foresight, and men of Gondor speaking in tones meant to hide their fear. Yet Aragorn's thoughts moved elsewhere. The real battle had already begun, long before swords would meet. It was not of steel but of will, the contest between despair and endurance, between false inevitability and quiet defiance. He remembered Gandalf's counsel, that the strongest light was not the one that blinded, but the one that endured. And so he resolved to hold his silence a little longer, to wield it as both shield and weapon, for in silence, even Sauron's gaze grew uncertain. That night, as the campfires burned low and men whispered prayers to names half forgotten, Aragorn walked among them. He spoke little, a hand placed on a shoulder, a glance exchanged, a few steady words of reassurance. These were his instruments. He did not promise victory. He promised only that their courage would not be wasted. That was enough. When dawn approached, a pale shimmer over the horizon, the riders prepared. The army was not vast, yet its unity gave it the weight of something older, something inevitable. Every man who rode beneath the white tree's banner carried within him a fragment of the same thought, that hope, even when uncertain, was still obedience to life. Anduril flashed in the first light of morning. It caught not the gleam of triumph, but of purpose. The sound of the scabbard leaving his belt was soft, yet it rippled through the camp like thunder refracted through memory. Those who saw the blade knew it had been forged for a moment, such as this, when faith required form, when lineage demanded proof. Far to the east, within the shadow of Barad-dûr, Sauron felt it, not as sight, but as disturbance, a dissonance in the order he had imposed. His servants whispered in haste. They did not name it Anduril, but the presence of something reforged, something renewed, set the air trembling. The eye turned, not in curiosity but in recognition. The long fear returned. The shape he had sought to extinguish had taken form again. Yet Aragorn's intent was not conquest. His was distraction, sacrifice, a calculated revelation meant to draw the eye away from the ring-bearer's path. To confront Sauron openly was madness. To confront him deliberately was mastery. This was the culmination of every silence endured, every restraint held, every decision delayed. Patience itself had become a weapon. He knew what must come. There would be losses, cries swallowed by the wind, and the slow unraveling of many lives. Yet beneath it all there would be order, the kind of order that emerges only from acceptance. Aragorn did not resist the cost. He simply carried it as he always had, quietly and without complaint. As the host began to move, banners lifted into the cold wind. The sound of hooves and marching feet rose together, not as clamor, but as rhythm. Even the earth seemed to answer in kind, a deep hum of resolve. Gandalf rode near the front, his staff dim but steady. Legolas walked lightly beside the riders, eyes half closed as if listening to what could not be heard. Gimli muttered a single prayer to stone, and behind them countless hearts beat in the same fragile harmony. From afar, it might have looked like the march of men to certain ruin. But from within it felt like the reawakening of a world. For Sauron had ruled through despair, and now despair itself was being challenged. Not by arrogance, not by glory, but by endurance. When night came again, Aragorn did not sleep. The plains stretched endless and black, and in their quiet expanse he felt a strange peace. The time of concealment was ending. His name, long carried in whispers, would now move with voice and presence. Yet even in revelation he would remain what he had always been, a servant of the greater design, not its master. To understand how that revelation would reach its crescendo, how fear and hope would stand eye to eye. We must now follow him to the very edge of darkness, where silence itself prepares to speak. The black gate loomed like a scar carved into the bones of the world. Twin towers, rigid and iron-crowned, framed the massive moor that sealed the desolation of Mordor from the lands beyond. The sky was the color of old bruises, neither fully day nor cleanly dusk. Dust rose without wind, as if the land itself recoiled from what approached. Before this threshold of shadow, Aragorn stood at the head of a host too small to conquer, yet too steady to be dismissed. The march had ended in silence. No trumpet, no cry. The men who followed him did so not with the hope of survival, but with the clarity of purpose. They knew why they were here. This was not a battle meant to be won. It was a gesture, precise and deliberate. A wedge driven into the gaze of the eye to turn it away from the mountain beyond. Aragorn had brought them not to strike down Mordor, but to hold its gaze long enough for another path to be walked in secret. He did not speak at first. His eyes swept the emptiness before the gate, the scorched stones and ash-choked earth. Somewhere beneath those shadows, countless orcs, trolls, and beasts watched, waiting for the command to pour forth. Yet none came. The tension was unnatural. Stillness, after so many leagues of movement, held heavier than swords. Gandalf rode forward beside him, face pale beneath the grey hood, staff resting lightly in his hand. They exchanged no words. Their understanding had passed beyond speech. Each knew what the other carried: wisdom and weight, vision and burden. When the heralds of Mordor emerged, they came with mockery carved into their voices. Mouth of Sauron, twisted and cruel, spoke not to negotiate, but to unravel. He cast lies like hooks, naming Frodo, naming torment, naming failure. Each word was designed to break resolve, to weaken the thread that held hope taut. Aragorn did not flinch. He stepped forward when silence had run its course, and his eyes, clear as the sea winds of the north, met the twisted visage before him. He said nothing at first. The silence became a mirror, returning the venom without absorbing it. And when he finally spoke, it was not with fury, but with command. No more lies. The voice was not raised, but it carried deep, final, cutting through the pretense. The mouth faltered, not visibly, but enough. Behind the helm and the sneer, something ancient stirred. Recognition. Not of power alone, but of legitimacy. Here stood a man who did not contest, but claimed. And then Aragorn drew Andúril. The blade flashed not with rage, but with remembrance. It gleamed like something that had waited long in the dark for its name to be spoken aloud. The herald recoiled. The gate remained closed, but a tremor passed through the ranks beyond it. Those watching from within the towers did not see merely a sword. They saw its meaning. They saw the return of something thought forever broken. The mouth fled behind the gate, and the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. Not absence, but suspense. Mordor was no longer merely watching. It was calculating. The eye had turned fully. In that moment, all its power, all its malice, all its doubt was bent upon this single host, standing at its door. Aragorn turned slowly, facing his men. He said no great speech, no rallying cry. Only this: hold fast. And they did, not with hope of victory, but with the resolve of sacrifice. For in the far distance, where fire burned on the edge of the world, another walked alone with the smallest burden and the heaviest fate. Aragorn had drawn the eye. Now they would bear its gaze. Whatever came next would come through blood. But what mattered most had already been won. The lie of Sauron's inevitability had been broken. He could be provoked, he could be threatened, and he could be deceived. The earth began to quake, the drums rolled low beneath the mountains, and from behind the Black Gate, the armies of Mordor began to emerge, not in fury, but in calculated release, like poison leaving a wound. The last march had begun. To understand how dread met silence, and how a single moment redefined both defeat and victory, we must now follow Aragorn through the gate, not as a king triumphant, but as a man standing where none were meant to stand. The ground trembled beneath them, but Aragorn did not move. Dust curled along the edges of his cloak as the first ranks of Mordor spilled through the Black Gate, a churning flood of metal and malice. Trolls with iron helms, orcs thick-shouldered and snarling, beasts bred for ruin. It was not a charge, but a slow, deliberate emergence, as if Sauron wished his enemies to witness the breadth of his power before it struck. The host of the West stood quiet in response. Their banners did not flutter, their swords did not rise in haste. Fear pressed against them like a rising tide, but none turned, not because they believed they would prevail, but because Aragorn stood among them calm, rooted, unwavering. His silence was their shield. Andúril remained drawn, held steady at his side, its edge catching the dim light like a flame still breathing in a sea of ash. Behind him, Gandalf's staff was raised, but it did not shine. The wizard's eyes were on the distance, not on the battlefield, but beyond, where a hidden fire moved slowly toward the heart of darkness. This was no longer a war of strength. It was a matter of time, distraction, endurance. Each moment purchased here bought another breath, another step for Frodo. Aragorn understood the cost. Every heartbeat, every sword raised in defiance was a thread in the great wager. The illusion must be total. The challenge must feel real. Sauron had to believe that this was the final stroke, that the heir of Isildur had come to claim his throne at the edge of ruin. So he stepped forward. Only a few paces, but the sound of his boots upon the earth echoed like thunder among the soldiers who watched him. He did not raise his voice, nor draw attention to himself. He simply walked to the front, where the distance between life and death was measured in breath, and waited. The enemy surged forward with a roar. Crude and broken voices lifted into a howl of hate. The earth cracked beneath them, and still Aragorn did not speak. He looked upon the tide and saw not monsters but consequence. This was the shape of Sauron's will made flesh. 1,000 years of fear, of silence, of hesitation, now rushing forward like a wave that believed it could drown a mountain. Then he raised his sword. He did not shout. He did not charge. He raised Andúril in one smooth motion, and the blade caught the grey light like morning breaking over dead stone. The gesture alone slowed the tide, not in speed, but in rhythm. The roar faltered for a breath, and that was the breath the West needed. Eomer and Imrahil moved to his flanks. Their men followed not blindly, not for glory, but with the quiet obedience of those who had already made peace with sacrifice. Merry and Pippin stood together in the second line, small forms in a world too large for them, yet unyielding. Behind them ranks adjusted, shields lifted, hearts hardened. The first clash came like a breaking wave. Swords met spears, shields cracked, screams rose into the sky. But Aragorn remained the fixed point amid the motion, not merely fighting, but anchoring the shape of the resistance. He moved with clarity, each strike measured, not in fury but in understanding. He was not there to win, he was there to hold. Above, the sky darkened further, but no rain fell. It was as if the heavens themselves withheld judgment. Time had become the battlefield now, stretched across minutes that felt like hours. The eye watched hungrily, urgently, its will pressing down upon the field like a weight meant to crush conviction. And still Aragorn stood, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol that refused to yield. Each man who saw him remembered something different. An old oath, a fire kept lit in a forgotten hall, a song sung over graves. He became all of them at once, and in doing so he became more than himself. Sauron, watching through shadow and will, felt it. The threat was not the sword, nor the line of men. It was the idea, the resurgence of something long buried. A king who had waited until the world was ready to remember him, a king who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. As the battle thickened and the ring drew closer to its end, the eye wavered, not in strength, but in certainty. That, above all, had been Aragorn's purpose, to unmake Sauron's vision by standing where none should have stood, and doing so without fear. To see how dread became undone, not by battle but by the moment it failed to recognize its true enemy. We must next return to the very heart of fire, where silence and will reached their final reckoning. The moment came not with thunder, but with silence. A stillness so complete it felt as though the air itself had been drawn inward, as if the breath of the world had been held in suspense. Aragorn stood amid the fury of battle, blood upon his brow, dust clinging to his cloak, Anduril gripped tightly in his hand. Around him the clash of war still raged, iron on iron, cries of wounded men, the roar of beasts. But it no longer mattered, for something deeper had shifted. In a space beyond sound, beyond sight, the ring had reached its end. Far from the field, upon the trembling precipice of Mount Doom, the fire had taken what could no longer be borne. The ring, the axis of fear, had unmade itself, and in that instant, Sauron's will, so long stretched across the world, snapped like a bowstring pulled too tight. The eye faltered. It shuddered in its tower, wavering in a blaze of sudden confusion. The gaze that had searched unceasingly, the will that had shaped orc and fortress alike, recoiled inward as if struck by something it could not understand. And Aragorn felt it, not as a sound or a vision, but as a void opening in the spine of the world, the weight of being watched, that ancient pressure pressing always down from the east, vanished. A tremor passed through the earth. The black gate buckled at its hinges, towers cracked. In the ranks of Mordor, confusion bloomed like wildfire. The trolls paused mid-charge. Orcs staggered. Their formation dissolved not by force, but by disintegration. Orders were no longer received. The bond that compelled them, that bound them in terror and obedience, had come undone. Anduril lowered. Aragorn did not raise it again. The war, though still roaring in the motion of bodies, had lost its meaning. He walked slowly through the chaos, not as a conqueror, not as a victor, but as a man emerging from the long shadow of doubt. Every step he took was heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from the knowledge of what had been bought and what it had cost. Behind him, Gandalf raised his face to the sky. The clouds, thick and unmoving for days, parted slightly, just enough for light to reach the field. It was not triumphant, it was solemn, a golden hush that draped the broken ground in mourning. Men of the West, seeing their enemies falter, did not cheer. They paused. They waited. A few dropped to their knees, not in joy, but in the overwhelming gravity of release. Something had passed from the world, something that had never slept. Aragorn turned and looked across the battlefield. He did not see triumph. He saw ruin. He saw the faces of those who had fallen, those who had stood with him, not to win, but to distract, to hold the eye long enough for the smallest hand to finish what no army could. That they had succeeded was a kind of miracle, but they had survived at all was another. In the east, a sound rose, not of music, not of speech, but of collapse. The tower of Barad-dûr, that monolith of domination, began to fall, stone cracked from within, not by assault but by absence. The will that had held it together had fled. It buckled like a man struck in the heart. A plume of smoke rose behind it, reaching toward the broken sky, and the eye, blazing frantic, flared once, then vanished, and with it the war ended. Aragorn dropped to one knee, not from pain, from stillness. He pressed one hand to the earth, as if grounding himself to something real, something unchanged by war or victory. The ground was warm, not with fire, but with life returning, slowly, shyly, like dawn after a long night. Around him, the scattered men of Gondor, Rohan, and all free peoples began to gather. They looked not to the east, but to him, not for orders, not for celebration, but because he had led them through a darkness so complete it had nearly unmade them, and he had done so not by force, but by steadiness, by silence. He rose. The wind shifted. In the distance, the banner of the white tree flared for the first time with full sunlight. Aragorn did not speak. He did not need to. The world had already heard. To see what remains after the silence lifts, and how a king is crowned not in gold, but in burden shared, we must return one final time to the man who waited long enough for the world to remember what it had almost forgotten. When the fire faded and the world stilled, dawn came with a softness it had not known in years. The first light spread slowly over the mountains, gilding the remnants of smoke with gold. The field that had been a battlefield no longer groaned beneath the weight of war. It exhaled quietly, as if the land itself remembered how to breathe. And in that silence stood Aragorn, no longer hidden, no longer a rumor, but still the same man who had walked unseen through shadow. The men gathered around him were weary beyond words. Their armor was dented, their banners torn, yet in their eyes flickered something fragile and unyielding, a return to themselves. They watched as Aragorn knelt once more, this time not in exhaustion but in reverence. His hand touched the earth, and the soil was warm beneath his fingers. He felt no triumph, only the immense gravity of what had been undone. Sauron had fallen, yes, but the cost was too vast to measure. Gandalf approached, his staff dim in the growing light. He looked not at the ruin, but at the man before him, the heir who had carried patience through despair and turned silence into strength. "It is finished," the wizard said, though his voice held sorrow as much as peace. Aragorn rose slowly. "No," he answered, "it has begun, for even in victory there was rebuilding to come. There were lands to heal, kingdoms to reconcile, griefs to honor. The sword that had ended one age must now defend another, not through war, but through wisdom." Andúril hung quietly at his side, no longer burning for battle. Its flame had cooled into something steadier, endurance, continuity, the quiet light of rightful rule. When he returned to Minas Tirith, the city waited not with celebration, but with breathless awe. Its walls, still scarred by siege, gleamed faintly in the morning. Bells rang, not in triumph, but in remembrance. Every echo was a requiem for those who would not see this dawn. Aragorn passed through the gate without herald. The people bowed as he walked, but he did not raise his head high. He greeted them with a gaze steady and kind, not as one elevated, but as one entrusted. He knew that power was not taken. It was given by those who chose to hope. At the citadel's steps, Gandalf turned to him and said softly, "Now comes the test all kings must face, the rule of peace." Aragorn met his eyes and said nothing. He did not need to. The coronation came in quiet grace. White petals fell from the ramparts, mingling with the last ashes of war. The crown of Gondor, ancient and heavy with history, was brought forth not as a prize, but as a question. When Gandalf placed it upon Aragorn's brow, the sky opened and sunlight poured down the mountain, illuminating the city in calm brilliance. He did not speak grand vows. He did not promise endless glory. He simply turned to the gathered thousands and said, "This day does not belong to me." His voice carried, clear and low, to the farthest tiers. "It belongs to those who endured." The crowd fell silent, and in that silence lay a deeper understanding. A kingdom restored not by might, but by memory. A ruler who stood not apart from his people, but among them. In the months that followed, the scars of the world began to mend. Rohan's green fields were sown again. The north stirred with life where ruins had once slept. The free peoples spoke to one another, not through emissaries, but through shared work. Peace did not come easily, but it came, truthfully, shaped by hands that had known loss. And often, when night fell over the White City, Aragorn walked alone upon the high terraces, looking eastward. The darkness there had not vanished entirely. It lingered, faint but enduring, as memory always does. Yet he no longer feared it, for he understood now that evil's truest defeat lay not in its destruction, but in the quiet persistence of light after it. He thought then of Frodo, of Sam, of all who had walked paths heavier than crowns. He thought of Isildur, whose weakness had once begun the long shadow, and of how that weakness had at last been redeemed, not by fire, but by patience. The wind stirred his cloak, carrying the scent of new earth and rain. Below him the city glowed with torchlight and laughter, fragile, human, alive. He smiled faintly, not as a man who had conquered, but as one who had endured long enough to see peace take its first uncertain breath. And so, in the golden hush of evening, the king stood where the ranger once walked, the silence around him no longer burden but blessing. The world had remembered him, not through fear, but through the quiet power that even darkness had learned to dread.